I've noticed a huge increase lately of companies coming into the cosmetic space who are trying to use the beauty industry as a force for good. And, I think it's really quite uplifting, actually. I'm talking about beauty brands and ingredient suppliers and data companies, all with the same mission, to do good. And beauty lends itself pretty well for this, as the regulations around cosmetic ingredients aren't always nearly as stringent as those for the food industry, for instance. And also, I think the cosmetic sector gives more scope to indie brands, so independent, smaller brands, to fulfill a valuable niche. And everywhere we look, the news feeds like to report on bad stuff, right? We open up our news feeds, we open up the newspapers, we see doom and gloom and war and famine and displacement, and generally unhappy, divided people all arguing with each other. So I thought, let's do something different today. And let's shine a light on all of the positive work done by the people I've interviewed on this podcast over the last few years. Because last week's interview with John Rutschalk of Biotara was a great example. And please do make sure you listen to that interview if you haven't yet. And I realized that I've had the privilege of telling the stories of so many people over the years, just like John's story. So hopefully I want you to walk away from this short episode with a big smile on your face, knowing that beauty, at least at the grassroots level, is trying to do better and that there is so much good in the world. We just maybe don't report on it enough. So settle in while I tell you some uplifting stories. Hi, it's Lorraine Dallmeier, Chartered Environmentalist, Biologist and CEO of the award-winning online organic cosmetic formulation school, Formula Botanica. I host the Green Beauty Conversations podcast, and these are my Green Beauty opinions, where I challenge you to think differently about how the beauty industry works and where it's heading. If you enjoy these episodes, make sure you subscribe so you never miss one. So let me share some of the good news in beauty with you. And what really struck me as I looked back at so many of the guests I've interviewed and their amazing stories over the years. And what's fascinating is that so many of the people I've interviewed over all the years have never met each other. They're working in completely different parts of the world, yet they're solving the same problems in remarkably similar ways. So I wanted to start with waste, which isn't the sexiest of topics, but it's a great one to target for the beauty industry. So in episode 211, I spoke to Harry McIlwraith from the Upcycled Beauty Company, who are taking food waste here in the UK, so think berry seeds and spent grains and byproducts from food production, and they're turning those into genuinely useful cosmetic ingredients. Not because it sounds good, but because the waste streams already exist, and throwing them away simply makes no sense. And that story links beautifully with episode 199, if you haven't heard that one yet, where I spoke to Thomas Kerfoot from Owen3 and Inky Ingredients. Thomas and his team are working with fruit waste from juice and jam production across Europe, and they're cold pressing discarded seeds into high quality oils. And then they're making sure that even those byproducts go back into animal feed. So here we have different companies, different routes, but the same instinct, which is to stop pretending that waste is inevitable and start designing it out of the system. And then I found there were so many stories on the podcast that were rooted in place and people. So episode 239, definitely one of my favorites. I spoke to Jane Dunlop of Aluan, who are producing coconut oil on a small Indonesian island, the island of Simeulue, while actively protecting rainforest and marine ecosystems and building real community empowerment there. Fantastic story. And they sell most of their coconut oil to Lush, who are doing an amazing job. Or take episode 255, where I spoke to Chloe Valet from Prime Green, who are working with Amazonian communities to help them become long-term ingredient suppliers rather than exploiting raw material sources. That belief comes through just as strongly in episode 289, where I spoke to Asa Siguitan of Essential Farms and Forests about restoring Hawaii's sandalwood forest through patience and stewardship, playing a very long game, restoring forests while creating meaningful livelihoods that are rooted in place. And his story is a powerful reminder that regeneration doesn't follow business timelines, and that's precisely why it works. And that same thinking appears again in episode 291 with Alexander van Oort of Forestwise, where we talked about sourcing models that are designed to keep forests standing by default, not as an afterthought. And when you line all of those stories up, and I've just given you 4 examples here, it becomes impossible to believe that protecting nature means freezing people out of it. In every case, people are part of the solution. And those 4 people I just mentioned, they're all working on different continents, different countries, dealing with different crops. But exactly the same belief runs through all of the conversations I had with them, which is that conservation only works if people can earn a dignified and dependable living. Forests and plants aren't destroyed because people don't care. They're destroyed because people need options. And these companies, the ones I've interviewed, they're creating those options. But it's not just forests, of course, either. In episode 235, I spoke to Catarina Rica of Inclita Seaweed Solutions in Portugal, whose team is working with coastal communities to harvest seaweed in ways that actively regenerate marine ecosystems. And that conversation linked beautifully with episode 181, where I interviewed Jeff Chapin from Carbon Wave, who looked at the huge sargassum seaweed blooms that are choking Caribbean coastlines and asked a completely different question, which was, what if this environmental problem could become a resource? And his company now turns that algal bloom into a cosmetic emulsifier. And his interview also pairs with episode 215, where I spoke to Matthew Perkins of Macro Oceans, who are working with ocean farmers in Alaska to grow and process seaweed into cosmetic ingredients, without waste, without fertilizers and pesticides. So one of those people is harvesting carefully, one is removing excess biomass, and one is building entirely new infrastructure. Different seas, different oceans, different challenges, but the same respect for our ecosystems and the same long-term mindset. And then there's the work that makes all of this possible behind the scenes. In episode 203, when I interviewed Joel Tasher of Clean Hub, we didn't talk about ingredients at all. We talked about infrastructure for waste, about stopping plastic from being burned or dumped simply because there's no alternative. And that conversation then sat perfectly alongside episode 265, where I spoke to Carly Snyder of the Pact Collective about what happens to beauty packaging after we're done with it, and why take-back schemes only work if the infrastructure exists to support them. She also told me about the painstaking way that people are removing teeny tiny bits of plastic from beauty packaging to be able to recycle them properly. And what struck me in both of those conversations was how closely this mirrors ethical ingredient sourcing. Whether it's ingredients or packaging, nothing works unless the systems are in place. Good intentions aren't enough, and you need the infrastructure to make the right choice, the easy one. And they're trying to create that infrastructure. And then running through many of these conversations on the podcast is a deeper question about what beauty is actually for. And in episode 213, when I spoke to Ruth Andrade from Lush, we talked about regeneration, not just in farming or supply chains, but in how people feel about themselves, about whether beauty reinforces impossible standards or whether it can help people feel more at home in their bodies and in the world. And that conversation ties everything together, because a truly regenerative industry doesn't just protect ecosystems, it doesn't harm people either. So when you zoom out and connect all of these dots, all the ones I've been talking about, something becomes very clear. This isn't isolated good behavior. Instead, it's a pattern, because people all over the world are independently arriving at the same conclusions, which is that, firstly, waste is a design flaw, not a fact of life. Nature survives when people have agency and income. Finally, regeneration takes time, but that's not a weakness. And isn't it just wonderful to hear all of these stories told as one big picture? So my challenge to you for this week is a simple one. If any of the stories that have been here on the podcast, the ones I've talked about today, any of the others that I've recorded, sparked something for you, just go back and listen to them properly and spend time with the people behind these ideas. Let yourself be reminded that there is a huge amount of thoughtful, hopeful work happening, often quietly, often without the hype, but with real impact. And most of all, I want you to keep the faith, because there are amazing people out there doing amazing things. And beauty, at least at grassroots level, really is part of that good news. So I hope that my good news in beauty for this week really does make you smile, because it certainly does for me. Thanks for listening to my Green Beauty Opinions. Remember to visit the Formula Botanica website at formulabotanica.com to try our free online formulation course. And if you haven't subscribed yet to the Green Beauty Conversations podcast, please do so now in your favorite podcast app. Leave me a review if you find these discussions and opinions useful, and I'll be back soon with my next episode.